Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about situations where there's a seller to find suitable housing contingency, but not only in addition to that, we're going to be talking about, a lot of these post-settlement leasebacks that are taking place. Actually, Morgan McGinnis brought this topic up and suggested it for a call, and I definitely think it's appropriate for the market we're in right now. Obviously, the seller kind of holds the gold, so to say, and a lot of these things are getting negotiated, whether it be a finding suitable housing contingency or a post-settlement leaseback. And they're creating some issues and potential liability with these things going on. A couple of them that I can think of before we get into maybe some examples and people sharing are, these finding suitable housing contingencies, sometimes you're extending settlements on end. And right now that poses problems for buyers in that, rates are continuing to go up. So when you have to extend settlement, you might be potentially looking at, extended rate lock pricing and potential increases in interest for buyers. So if you're writing those types of contracts, it might be wise to start, having that conversation up front with the listing agent and talking about if that situation was to occur, and maybe having some writing in your addenda that covers that type of scenario. The other thing is a lot of people are adding these post-settlement leasebacks, whether they're free or at some discounted rate. But I don't think a lot of people are, using probably what should be used is a formal lease. Because if you actually read the post-settlement possession addendum for a seller, it's really only to be used for a maximum amount of 30 days. And that actually, it says specifically in that addendum that this is not a lease. This is, simply a addendum to the agreement of sale. So if you're going to have something that's like a 3-month lease back or a 6-month lease back, again, whether it's free or has some type of rent involved in it, it's probably best to put together some type of formal lease agreement that covers all parties involved. If you have any questions with those, Brent obviously deals with those every single day and can help you draft those up, as well as Kong or myself can do that. Has anyone had a situation that they want to share right now that they've ran into recently, that they've had issues with these either settlement contingencies or post-lease addendums? I see Morgan just got on the call here. Morgan, you brought this topic to us. Did you have a specific situation that you ran into where you had any troubles with this, or just thought it was relevant for the market right now?
I personally haven't run into any issues, but I have run into a lot of buyers in the situation where we need to represent them properly, but the seller's like, well, we want to find a home of choice. And right now we have a seller that is kind of dragging his feet a little bit and finding a home of choice. So it's like, okay, well, what is the best practice here? How do we properly represent the buyer to make sure that this process isn't getting drug on forever? Because of course, the longer that it goes, the interest rates are changing. We may need to pay for rate lock extensions and stuff like that. So I think it was just more or less what's everyone else seeing and what's everyone else doing to help in this situation? Because of course I want them to get the house, and that's great, but I want to make sure that we're representing them and protecting them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And before you got on, I was bringing up those potential issues with the finding suitable housing contingencies. Like you said, sometimes these things are getting drug on almost endlessly. So it's very important to have specific dates always, you know, in your contracts and in these types of contingencies. That way, the buyer has a means of getting out and it isn't indefinite, more or less. As well as addressing, like you said, the potential rate increases and rate lock extensions. That's very important. So
Is
if
there
you guys,
is there like a specific form that you're using?
typically, I think people are either putting that in the additional terms section of the last page of the contract or on a separate general addendum for, you know, finding suitable housing contingencies.
Okay.
If you guys ever need another set of eyes or help putting together this verbiage, obviously we're not attorneys, but Seth down in our settlement department is very good at drafting these types of things. And, you know, obviously we can lean on JB at times too for help. So whenever you're putting these together, please reach out if you have any questions. I think Tracy Weigel's on the call here this morning. Did you have a specific situation too that you ran into with any of these scenarios? Tracy, we're having some trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me better now?
It's sounding really muffled. We can't hear you.
Let's try one more time. I had a listed property, and the gentleman needed to find suitable housing. He was not planning on taking out a mortgage. He was planning on using the funds from the sale of his house to purchase his big property. So he did not want to do any type of financing. So we did list his house as coming soon. I had shown him 2 properties that he was willing to write an offer on. So at that point in time, we decided to go ahead and put the house, make the house happen. We had.
We can't hear you, Tracy.
All right, sorry guys.
Yeah. So let's actually go back then to Morgan a second. Tell me a little bit about the situations that you're having of the seller finding suitable housing. Are they signing the contract contingent upon them finding suitable housing in a period of time, or are they signing the contract that they'll lease back for a period of time in order to find suitable housing? Which way is it happening?
So on the one that I did, we did a time period on there. So we said if the seller doesn't find suitable housing in X amount of days, then the buyer basically has the option to walk away. Now, the buyer still wanted the house and that time period was up and they still didn't find suitable housing. So we extended that. And then even after the extension, now they're doing a post-settlement rent back. And it's just like I told him, you know, there are obviously risks, but we do have the post-settlement rent back. So that way at that time, they have to go. And I think the other agent was saying they might even be like going to live in a hotel or something like that, because they just can't like find what they're looking for. But in situations, you know, even in representing the seller, how, you know, are you guys nudging them along to be sure that this is like going to go through and that the time that they're not going to take up so much time, especially, you know, with rates and everything else changing?
Mm-hmm. So the post-settlement rent back, is that in excess or less than 30 days?
I believe that one was for 30 days.
Okay. And I think what Brooks was saying, just so we're all on the same page, is if it's going to be longer than 30 days, then we should really use a standard residential lease agreement instead of the post-settlement lease agreement, because the post-settlement is literally a temporary thing, normally for, you know, a seller that's going to move out 5 days after settlement or 3 days after settlement, that type of thing. When we're getting into a lease where a seller needs to find suitable housing, and if the buyer is willing to wait because they really want that house and they've competed against 30 other offers and that's the only way they could get it, then we got to put a real lease in place so that in the event that there's a problem, you have the buyer, the new buyer who becomes the homeowner, has something to take to the district justice to enforce. So as far as time periods go, if you're postponing starting the inspection periods or anything like that, I mean, there's nothing you can do if you're going to take a contract like that it's contingent upon the seller finding suitable housing within 3 weeks or 4 weeks. I mean, there's no magic pill to lock the interest rate in longer that doesn't cost money, those type of things. But I think if you could convince people to take the offer with a lease back, at least then the buyer's got control over the things. Because now if you're making this all subject to the seller finding suitable housing, and let's say you postpone the inspections until after the seller finds suitable housing, okay? And then all of a sudden your buyer goes in and starts to do the inspections, and now they don't want the house, okay? Now the seller's in a bad position too, because now you're going to back out. So are you doing the inspections right away, even though the seller is trying to find suitable housing, or are you postponing those inspections?
That particular client actually waived inspections.
Okay.
He was VA and he had a pest inspection that was done prior to them finding suitable housing.
Okay, so in a lot of, I didn't think of that. In a lot of these cases, the buyer's already waiving the inspections. Now, when the market changes, that all will change too. But is there any, Kong, have you run into these at all? Or Brent, go ahead with the suitable housing problem.
Just want to mention how serious or important getting an actual lease in place is. Just a few examples. Who is responsible for payment of the sewer, the trash, the water, let alone what happens if something breaks in the home? What happens if the water heater goes? Who is now responsible? Is the new owner, meaning the buyer, or is the seller responsible? So it all has to be written out. That is why that the post-settlement leaseback is not good for more than 30 days. If it goes longer, unfortunately, inevitably, something's going to happen and then there's going to be a battle. So it's very, very important to be crystal clear who's going to be responsible for what, fees, etc. So that's all.
Have you had any of these situations with these post-settlement leases?
Not personally. I'm really against any type of post-settlement or pre-settlement lease on it, on a property, just because that's when more problems arise than you can imagine. Again, use the proper forms because it outlines everything in there. Just don't write it on the last page of the contract, contingent on seller finding suitable housing, because what does that mean? What's the time frame for them to do that stuff? If you're going to do inspections, if you are allowed to do inspections, I would do them right away, but have some kind of verbiage that if the seller doesn't find suitable housing, he's responsible to pay back the buyer for all expenses put in, you know, and outline those expenses. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of it, but definitely ask a lot of questions too, because it depends on where the seller is at. Are they building a house that you know, it's drywalled and paint and all they're doing is the fine tuning of it, or you know, or are they just starting out fresh? I mean, they're not even pre-qualified to get a loan yet. So you're going to want to ask a lot of questions, and you know, on the list side, you're going to have to know these questions and answers so that the buyers feel comfortable pursuing your listing.
And you brought up calling the pre-settlement lease, not just the post-settlement lease. I mean,
Oh,
we
yeah.
have situations where people come to us and say, what do you think about my buyer doing a pre-settlement lease? And they haven't even gotten final mortgage approval or the appraisal hasn't been completed. And then
Yeah, actually,
go ahead.
yeah, that's why I brought that up, because that's what we were dealing with last week. We had a pre-settlement lease agreement. And again, remember John Leidy's whole phrase is a deal isn't a deal unless it's fair to all parties. If it's lopsided, you're going to have problems eventually. Maybe not right now, but maybe like a week before settlement, which is probably the worst time to have it. You know, if your buyer is going to occupy a home and the seller is going to allow it, make them pay something. You know, I know as a buyer agent, we want to protect the buyer, but we have to keep in mind the consumer notice also says that we will be a fair party to all parties. Okay, so if you can get your buyer into a house for even $25 a day, that's a heck of a lot cheaper than renting a hotel. But at the same time, they have a monetary agreement and a way to, you know, move the deal along instead of just not moving the deal along because they're not paying anything there. So it's just stuff like that that comes up, and then later on, the seller, when they finally read the fine print, they feel slighted, and they'll use that against you. You know, because now you're stuck. You need a place to move, and they'll say, "No, you're not moving." And it's too hard at that point to hire an attorney, go to the justice, and enforce the contract when you don't have like 4 days to go. Okay, so just stuff like that.
Anybody else have any situations with regards to post-settlement lease agreements that, or the seller finding suitable housing or anything like that, that they're dealing with, and tell us about how you handled it? You got one, Seth, that you know of anybody?
Well, I do have a comment. You know, I forget what it is without looking. I don't know if it's the pre or the, I guess it's the pre, where there's a spot on the form for a deposit. The buyer's putting down an additional deposit, and it's going to be held by the listing broker, which is just fine. But when there's a lender involved, the lenders don't always want to see these rental forms, but yet the form itself says that the deposit is going to be used towards the purchase of the property. So we have kind of like conflicting information. So what I'm getting to is, whenever you're doing one of these forms, we definitely have to check with the lender, if there is one, to make certain that they're going to use this additional deposit towards the purchase, or if they don't want to see it. Just a comment.
Hey, Tim, real quick too. Let's say you do a 6-week or a 2-month rent back to a seller, and your buyer is just making a temporary move to this area. He's going to be there for 2 or 3 years. When they go to sell the house, don't they have to claim that, or at the end of the year, claim that as income?
I have no idea. That would be an account question.
Right. Or when they fill out the form and it says, has this property ever been used for rental or business purposes? I mean, technically that's a yes, right?
Does it?
So that's why I hate renting back and doing all that stuff. Just
Right.
Get the deal to settlement, exchange keys, part ways.
What happens if they don't find suitable housing and they continue to stay, you know, on the lease back? So now you got to go through an eviction process. And they have their money, if you settle.
Right.
So there's all kinds of problems that can come up with it. But we understand that they are problems because half these people can't find suitable housing. So it's a double-edged sword.
Is this happening like in your guys' market, or is this kind of just something that we're dealing with in Chambersburg?
But I think it's just Chambersburg.
Great.
No,
No,
it happens everywhere across the country.
yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. Because just when you say, oh, let the seller live there for 6 months until they find something. What if they don't find something in 6 months? At what point does it get cut off? What if they're not really looking? Because I said the other day, we made an offer on the property and we said the seller could live there for 6 months for free to try to get the advantage of them to take our offer versus somebody else's offer. But what happens at the end of 6 months if they don't move? Then we got a problem we got to deal with. It's a lot nicer when we follow the contract and the seller gives possession at settlement to a vacant house. So anybody
What
else?
is the time periods that you guys are using? Like when someone does want a rent back or they do want time to find suitable housing, what are you guys recommending we allow? Like, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month?
I think it just depends on the situation and the seller situation. But obviously, as we talked, if it goes any further than 30 days, you need a specific lease agreement, the residential lease agreement in place, spelling out all the details that Brent talked about, and also, a termination date. That way, if it comes to that date, you have a means of getting that seller out if they then become a squatter.
It also depends upon how bad the buyer wants the house. And are they willing to wait for the seller to find it, knowing that the seller has agreed to sell it to them and not the other 29 people that made the offer? Again, it's a double-edged sword. How bad does he want it? How bad are they willing to wait? It's a pretty hard situation right now for a buyer to get a property when there's 30. I mean, in our area last week, we had several that had between 20 and 30 offers on a property. I mean, that means that 29 other people didn't get it. And when they don't get it multiple times, they're willing to become a little more lenient to the seller's conditions the next time. But every time we become more lenient to the seller's conditions is when we're creating more problems for ourselves, because what happens if they don't move or look for a property? Now the buyer who settled on it, again, has to go through the eviction process. And Brent, that could be a nightmare too, right?
It sure can. Yeah, that's not fun, and it could be very timely.
And costly.
You're looking at a minimum of 45 to 60 days just to start the process, and then, a lot of money above and beyond that.
And then you were explaining to somebody the other day, if they know what they're doing, they could drag it out past the district justice process right to the Cumberland County or Franklin County or Dauphin County courthouse.
Yep, they sure could. They could be a professional tenant, if you will, and they could be sitting in that home or living in that home for months, literally months. It just, I guess, simplistic terms, Tim, using your analogy, once that seller is going to try and find suitable housing, they are now going to become one of those 29 people that didn't get housing. So they just go right into the pool of a buyer. And again, it's just going with Kong. It just makes things so messy when you're trying to think, okay, Mr. Seller, we're going to allow you time, but that seller is now going to be one of those 29 people that are submitting offers to another seller. It just gets very messy.
You know, we're also, I'm sure that there's a lot of people on this call that has these buyers competing for these offers. They're buying with emotion because they've lost on a couple deals, and then they end up wanting out of the deal they ended up agreeing to because they start having second thoughts about what they did to just even get it under control. So, you know, I'm sure that that's happening too. And, you know, if it is happening, you know, what if they waived all the inspections? What if they waived everything and they put a big deposit down? Now, well, that's all at risk. So people are buying with a lot of emotion right now. It's situations we've never had before in the cycles that we've gone through in real estate. We've never had these situations like this ever before, at least not my 40 years. So, yeah. Anybody else? John Shannon, you got anybody that's causing problems like this with, I mean, you've been in it a long time.
I don't at the moment,
Okay.
but I do foresee running up against it here. I've got quite a few deals that are simmering right now that are in that situation. So that's why I thought this call would be extremely beneficial to get
Right.
on. And
Which way do you think it works better, to try to get it under control and give a post-settlement lease agreement, or to try to give them time up front?
I typically, in the past, I would give them time up front. I would say typically I would go 30 days.
Right.
And if within 30 days you haven't found something, the buyer has the right to cancel this agreement and move on, and all deposit money is returned.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem we're running into with that upfront scenario right now is the interest rates are changing on us.
Right. And you're competing.
So, yeah. But I mean, the interest rates have increased a tremendous amount in a short period of time. And if it continues on that way, then all of a sudden the buyer who's waiting for the seller to find suitable housing, it's throwing them into a tailspin. You know, Brooks just had one the other day where the rate was floated and it made a difference of $200 a month on the rate change. Okay. Well, $200 a month with some of these buyers puts them completely out of the deal.
Right.
So that change of $200 a month. So we got to pay more attention to really the details of the interest rates, the sellers wanting suitable time to find suitable housing, you know, any sort of post-settlement lease agreements. We really got to pay attention to limit any sort of problems we could get into with this. So that's my suggestion, is really pay attention to the details.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff's not going away by any means. It's the market. It is what it is. Everyone's looking for a creative way to get somebody a home, and you know, these things are going to be offered, but the important thing is to have the details covered, like my uncle's saying. And if you have, again, any questions on what lease agreement you should be using, what verbiage and stuff needs to be put in these addenda, you know, reach out to Seth, myself, Kong, my uncle, and we'll help you.
Kong, you're making me tired. How long is this airport that you're walking through?
It's Atlanta, and they just changed the gate on me last minute.
Oh, okay.
And we go to another concourse.
Good luck. Have a safe trip back. That's all I got, Brooks. You know, do we have a topic for next week, or?
Yeah, we do. We've got a couple of them. I haven't picked one yet, but I'll push that out here later this week. And, you know, we'll have a meeting next Tuesday at 9 a.m.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, everyone.